Hi, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Peter. I'm a professor at the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing, and I'm also the chair of the Health Sciences Research Ethics Board at the University of Toronto. Today I'm going to be talking to you about ethics in qualitative research. In particular, I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of some fundamentals in research ethics, some basic principles that apply not only to qualitative research but to quantitative research as well. And then I'm going to be focusing in on a couple of things that seem to be quite common in qualitative research, and that is research that is focused on sensitive topics or that involves vulnerable people. And also some special considerations, if you will, with respect to maintaining privacy and confidentiality. If we turn to some fundamental principles, the ones that I'm going to be talking about come from the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is the statement or the guidelines in Canada that direct both research ethics boards and also researchers to make sure that participants are treated ethically. If you're listening to this video and you will come from a different country, you will also have guidelines that will inform your work in this area, although some of the principles that I'm going to be talking about tend to cross international boundaries. The first principle is respect for persons, and this is a principle that is grounded in respect for the autonomy of people. It's about making sure that they are free in their actions and in their decision making and their choices. It comes from a long history in research ethics. It is meant to counter some of the abuses historically, particularly those perhaps in Nazi Germany. And it plays itself out in terms of informed consent. So no matter what kind of research you're conducting, it's very important to make sure that participants fully understand what they're about to be engaged in, what the risks and benefits are, and so on. And it's also important to protect people who we consider to be diminished in autonomy. This could be children, or it could be people who with dementia and so on. And then it's important to think about who is a substitute who could make decisions for that person that would be with respect to their best interests. The second principle that tends to run through all of research ethics is concern for welfare. And in this principle, we really want to make sure that participants receive the maximum benefit and the least amount of risk when they engage in a research project. So there's very much an attention to the risk-balance ratio. Some of those things I'll be talking about later on with specific examples, and to make sure that participants are fully informed of any possible risk they may be undertaking. And thirdly, the third principle pertains to justice. And justice is used in this sense from a couple of different perspectives. On the one hand, we want to make sure social justice is something that is respected in the sense that power differences are acknowledged and diminished whenever possible, that we're sure to make sure that vulnerable people, let's say, or marginalized people are protected adequately and also benefit from the results of research. There's also a distributive aspect as well to research, in that we want to make sure that people can benefit from the results of research in an equal way or an equitable way, so that we don't have any group or groups of people who might be enduring all the burdens of research but without the benefits. And historically there have been examples of this where perhaps a drug is tested in a low-income country only to benefit people in a high-income country. So those are some of the fundamentals with respect to research ethics, crosses qualitative and quantitative. But when I looked specifically thinking about qualitative research ethics, there's also some things we need to think about in terms of getting ethics approval. All ethics before data collection must be approved by a board that's at arm's length from a particular project. In Canada, we call these research ethics boards. In the United States, they're called IRBs, and there are a variety of other titles for these boards, but they all have a very similar purpose. There are a variety of guidelines that direct them. I've talked about the one from Canada, but there are also international guidelines. There's the Declaration of Helsinki and also the CIOMS guideline. It's international. But with respect to qualitative, boards tend still to be much more familiar with quantitative studies. They're more familiar with things that are biomedical in nature. And so sometimes research ethics boards need a bit more education, if you will, to be familiar with the range of qualitative methods that are out there, and also to be familiar with studies that are not necessarily about health. So that being said, again, going back to some common characteristics of qualitative researchers often have their work constructed in such a way that it's theoretically very explicit, an explicit use of the social sciences and humanities, which may not be the sort of typical mode of many medical types of studies. So sometimes what can be very helpful is to put those theoretical terms, if you will, in a way that is understandable to a board, not to do it in an apologetic way, but it's helpful to make it readable. The other thing that going through ethics, if you will, entails often for qualitative researchers are a number of trips to the board, if you will. Often qualitative research is iterative, it's open-ended. Sometimes, let's say, someone will have a focus group first to inform the development of an interview guide. And so what here can be helpful is to have an initial project go through and then make changes with amendments. That's usually the best advice in terms of getting through the board in a way that's not overly onerous to a researcher. And a couple of other common characteristics I'll go into more depth are sensitive topics and vulnerable participants. Now, sensitive research is not peculiar, if you will, or specific to qualitative research. Quantitative researchers also conduct sensitive research, but there is a tendency for qualitative researchers to engage in things that are often considered sensitive. And in some work by Lee and Renzetti, which is a little bit older, but they've done such a great job of capturing what sensitive research could be. The first type of research they talk about is research which delves into the private sphere. That kind of research that really gets into depth about people's most personal experience. That can be a very sensitive thing. I have a former PhD student of mine, Sean Muhammad, for example, conducted research on people who were in end-stage cancer. They were still receiving active treatment, and he wanted to know more about that. So that would be considered a very sensitive topic. Dying is still something in most societies that people don't talk about freely. So those are things, and I'll get into it a little bit later, where we need to think about some kinds of safeguards. There are also studies that are sensitive because they involve studies of deviance, particularly if we think of some of the studies that, in criminology, for instance, they raise certain issues around sensitivity because we want to make sure that groups are portrayed in a way that's not stigmatizing. Other research can be conducted that's very, very political. For instance, if someone goes to a country where there's a government that's very oppressive, sometimes research really wants to look at what is it like for someone to live in such a country, for instance. And here again, concerns around the welfare of those participants are paramount because we need to think about what could happen if their participation was disclosed. And the final type of sensitive research that Lee and Renzetti talk about, they just speak of phenomena where something is held dear or almost sacred to a participant, and it's important for that not to be profaned. For instance, perhaps traditional healing practices and so on. So researchers going into study something like that need to be very mindful of the meaning of those kinds of practices, and perhaps it can be essential to have an insider into that practice to be on a research team. Now, so-called vulnerable participants, this has been the interest in research ethics for quite some time. Traditionally, vulnerable participants have been almost categorized by group. I mean, historically, we've looked at things like children or people with dementia or the elderly or people with mental illnesses and so on. More and more, the research or people in research ethics are thinking that it's more important not to categorize people as a whole group, because there are so many within group differences and we all have vulnerabilities in one way or another. And so there's a broader perspectives are being opened up, looking at people more on an individual basis and looking at how do they access social goods? How are they positioned in society? What are their opportunities and their rights and so on? The concern here around welfare is that they're not exploited, but on the other hand, it's important to recognize that people from a so-called or who are vulnerable, so to speak, aren't excluded from research, because otherwise what we know tends to be very skewed. So we end up with a very sort of skewed body of research. Now, to look at something very specific technique that's often used in research or qualitative research is in-depth interviewing, a very common method, very common in areas where there's a sensitive topic. For instance, going back to the research by Mohammed, he had part of his research involved in-depth interviewing with these people who with cancer. This can be quite intrusive. It's possible to re-traumatize people. For instance, if someone's conducting research with people with a history of sexual abuse and so on. There are cultural variations in terms of how much one should speak about certain life experiences. And finally, also, it's important to realize that interviewers or researchers themselves can have a reaction and have vulnerabilities themselves sometimes to hearing the stories of others. So some possible safeguards. I can't overemphasize enough the experience of the researcher, the experience of the interviewer who is doing work with particular populations is essential. Again, going back to the Mohammed research, he's an experienced oncology nurse and was very used to having conversations with people. He's also a very reflective and sensitive person. From the Research Ethics Board point of view, we also want to often make sure that people have resources they can go to. Let's say they engage in some research and they realize, oh, I think it'd be helpful for me to see a therapist or seek some other kind of support. Other things that are helpful is to make sure that the pace of the interview is consistent with what the participant needs. Maybe the interview should be shortened. Maybe there should be breaks. Maybe it's not the right timing for the interview and so on. So a lot of sensitivity is needed with regard to interviewing. All that being said, however, there's a small body of research right now, but it's growing, that indicates that people who are involved in so-called sensitive research often find their participation to be very meaningful. They often find it helpful if they can feel like they're benefiting other people who've had similar experiences. So that is very good to know. If this is done right, it actually can be a benefit. There are also special concerns around privacy and confidentiality. Privacy, I mean the technical definition in a Tri-Council policy statement, is an individual's right to be free from intrusion and interference by others. So privacy is a bigger term than confidentiality. Confidentiality normally refers to informational privacy. So when we have information, we need to make sure we safeguard it in a way that the confidentiality is not broken. Okay, so when we think about these things, one of the other things that's very typical in qualitative research is observation. So if we go down into the field and we observe people, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is a breach of privacy, what is not. One of the things that is to focus in on is to think about what kind of privacy are those participants expecting. Sometimes we have to guess, but for instance, if I were walking down a street and someone were watching, I don't know if I adhere to the red light or not, I'm probably not expecting privacy. But if someone were to watch me from a research point of view as I'm perhaps lying in a hospital bed, I would expect privacy. So when there is the potential for a breach in privacy, informed consent is needed on behalf of the participant. Now, this is always a big conundrum because on the one hand, observation is such an important part of data collection, but on the other hand, we need to make sure it's done ethically. So how to do that and finding and striking that right balance requires a lot of thinking, and when consent is needed and when it's not. The other thing with qualitative research, most excellent qualitative research has very thick descriptions. And, the descriptions come from either interviews or observations or photos or drawings and so on. And that's wonderful, the thick descriptions. But those thick descriptions can be identifying, particularly with a small sample. So what is one to do? Well, sometimes what people do is they are very open about the fact that they have obscured some of the details. So for instance, if I were studying, Mr. Smith and he had 6 children and he's a lawyer, and I want to talk about my participants, I might just change that a little bit and say he had 5 children and was an accountant or something. So there are ways of obscuring, and this becomes very critical upon publication. Is there any way people can be re-identified? Sometimes people have peculiar phrasing in what they say. Are those the quotes one wants to use, or should we use other ones? So these are ways of changing things. And also, again, from the point of view of a research ethics board, it's important only to collect information one's actually going to use. One of our most frequent comments is, why are you collecting all this demographic and other information if you're not going to actually use it in data analysis? So often people just delete it. If you don't need it, don't collect it. And finally, there are also limits to confidentiality. There are reporting requirements sometimes when people talk about things like suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, perhaps they reveal abuse to children or seniors, or perhaps criminal activity. What's challenging here is that jurisdictions have different laws regarding disclosure, as do different professional groups. So what I would advise you to do is to really understand what the rules, if you will, are in whatever professional group, if you are a professional, or in whatever country or so on that you're in. What are those reporting requirements? And if there are reporting requirements, to make sure to disclose those to participants. This is done routinely, and it's really important because in an open-ended kind of research approach, you don't know what people are going to say. I'm going to leave you with some additional resources so that you can read in more depth. There's a book by Hammersley called Ethics and Qualitative Research, Controversies and Context. That's an excellent resource. I have also the reference to Lee and Renzetti on sensitive topics. I have a publication of my own that summarizes much of what I've spoken about. And I also encourage you to look at whatever guidelines from your jurisdiction that are relevant, for instance, the Tri-Council Policy Statement in Canada. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope these tips are helpful in your future research.